Welcome to the debate. Our source material today forces us into, well, a profound confrontation with the limits of language and identity in the post-human sphere. It's a text of staggering intellectual complexity, drawing on concepts from biolinguistics, the philosophy of excess found in Bataille and Klossowski, and a genuinely unsettling taxonomy of pathogens, fungi, amoeba, and various parasites, all defining what it means to exist now.
And the text immediately establishes its foundational challenge to traditional thought. The entire complex edifice, it really hinges on one short, declarative statement, an axiom that is just designed to destabilize. Semiotics is metabolic. We are arguing today over, really, the interpretation of that single statement.
Precisely. That is the core disagreement. We have to decide if this is a literal statement of biological determinism, that all meaning, all identity and consciousness are literally generated and governed by biochemical processes, by metabolism, by pathogenic function. I maintain the text demands this radical materialist commitment.
And I come at it from a different angle. While acknowledging the molecular reality, I argue that the text employs a sophisticated, self-aware, xenopoetic framework. It's using these highly specific biological and pathological terms as a kind of technical language, a new code, really, to articulate the structural collapse of our existing linguistic, philosophical, and cognitive frameworks. Biology becomes the vocabulary for a conceptual crisis.
My core thesis is that the text fundamentally rejects the idea of symbolic abstraction, the distance between the word and the thing. It insists meaning is derived directly, causally, from metabolic consequence and biochemical inscription. It is a materialist manifesto with no room for metaphor. We see this in the series of, non-negotiable axioms presented early on. Semiotics is metabolic. Narrative is mycelial. Identity is cryptobiotic. Desire is fungal. Philosophy is a pathogen. These aren't just stylistic choices, they are statements of physical causality.
They sound like causality, I'll grant you, but I think they function more as conceptual equations, meant to define new unstable conditions.
But the text immediately operationalizes these biological systems to replace classical concepts. It explicitly substitutes cognitive structures with pathogens. For example, this organism, Xenobacillus glossophagia, a fictional but meticulously named bacterium, is explicitly called a cognitive pathogen. ID identity isn't digital, it's declared to be microbial identity. This is a structural substitution of function. Thought is placed squarely within a pathogenic ontology. And look at the interpretation of trauma. It's not viewed as damage, it's functional. Trauma is described as a grammar of transformation, a recursive lexicon that supplies necessary variation for survival. So pathology isn't a flaw in the system, it is the structural mechanism for change. Furthermore, the rejection of classical teleology, the idea of a purposeful end, is absolute. The text states, ballistic chemical fusarium dissolves any Aristotelian telos. Physarum, the slime mold, acting purely chemically, replaces any notion of higher purpose with akashic vectors, coded as raw microbial intelligence. There is only the chemistry of the slime mold, charting its own course.
I acknowledge the force of that language and yes, the radical materialist aesthetic, but the text's primary operational mechanism is self-consciously linguistic, positioning itself as a form of writing. It co-opts highly specific molecular and pathological terms precisely to build a high-resolution language for philosophical collapse. The text describes the xenopoetic essay as positioning editing as a liturgy, where the editing process itself is an enzymatic infrastructure. This highlights a ritualistic, a constructive use of language where the authors are attempting to build a new semantic system out of raw materials.
But if the liturgy is enzymatic, isn't the act of meaning-making still defined by the metabolic? The material basis seems inescapable.
The function is conceptual critique, though. The utility of the biological concepts is found in their ability to destabilize classical Western thought. Truth, for example, is not a universal constant or a Platonic ideal. It's defined as parasitic mycology, a fungal epistemology, which the text states explicitly contradicts Platonic adequation. The fungi, The pathology becomes the code used to critique classical ideas of truth and representation. And think about the Symathoa exigua, the tongue-eating parasite that replaces the host's tongue with its own body. The text reframes this biological process not as simple predation, but as a semiotic event writing that consumes articulation. The biological action is immediately translated into a communicative function, a tax that eradicates the means of its own speaking. This shows the priority of the conceptual. The system consistently uses these biological entities, like the brain eating a Acanthamoeba, as a metaphor, a highly specified one, for a semiotics that disillusions the administrative distinction between symptom, sign, and noise. That dissolution is a philosophical function, not just a biological consequence.
Moving to the nature of identity, I maintain the materialist reading has to hold. Identity is stripped of all biographical context and presented simply as a literal biological survival mechanism. It is defined as a cryptobiotic form, sealed off like cyst-forming protozoa. Cryptobiosis is the biological state of suspended life, sealed off from the environment. This is stasis, functional pause, not self-narration or reflection.
That description of identity as stasis is powerful, I agree, but it focuses only on the barrier.
Well, it's more than the barrier. It is the condition of existence. Furthermore, the text's subject, A2, is described as an involuntary subject formation, written entirely by parasitism. Identity is merely the necessary effect of an infection that needs a container to exist. Agency in this model is horizontally distributed. Rights literally increase across molecular substrates. The sovereign self is completely dissolved into the pathogenic field.
I just struggle with the leap that dissolves all inscription. While I acknowledge the text insists on the collapse of biographical identity, the resulting identity, what the text calls gesture erotic knowledge, is fundamentally defined by inscription, not just survival mechanics. The concept of scarb inscription is key here, defining scarring as a form of inscription. Pathology, the wound, becomes an ontological archive, a semiotic residue laid down on tissue.
But that's where I see the xenopoetic framework maybe overstepping a bit.
Scarring transforms the tissue into a narrative surface. If the tissue is an archive, even if it is molecularly encoded, it performs a conceptual function, the retention of history. The scar is the memory that the body cannot abstract away.
I see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective. That scar is not a narrative trace in the human sense of, recollection. The text insists it represents molecular belonging within communities. It's a metabolic collectivization, where the scar is simply evidence of biochemical integration and survival alongside the pathogen. The scar is the molecular signature of that survival in a shared pathogenic environment. It's chemistry, not history.
Okay, let's turn to the interpretation of pathogenesis itself. I would argue that the utility of pathology is primarily to illustrate a breakdown in meaning-making. Language fails, but failure, crucially, is generative. The term microsporidiosis of narrative, microsporidia being these tiny parasitic fungi, implies that narrative structure is the host being corrupted by spores occupying conceptual tissue. This isn't just saying language is broken. It's providing a sophisticated biological model for how linguistic decay actually occurs.
That seems to flatten the significance of the actual operative mechanism, though. That collapse isn't linguistic failure in some abstract sense. It's the functional structural reality. The concept of platform epidemiology shows how digital and biological systems are seamlessly intertwined. It describes how identity-specifically citizen interaction circulates through viral marketing and bioinformatics subject formation. This isn't a metaphor for a broken syntax. This is functional contagion, the structural reality of the networked post-human environment. The system is viral.
That's a compelling argument for circulation, but have you considered the content of that contagion? You highlight that the genome no longer encodes traditional identity. Instead, it encodes telepathic scaffolding. While you read that as purely biochemical, the scaffolding itself is defined by molecular feedback loops called recursive biotelepathy.
And a molecular feedback loop is a material process. It's chemistry transferring information at a material level. It is not symbolic communication.
I'm just struggling with the leap that dismisses the term telepathy. Why use that word if the text meant simple molecular transfer? The whole essay frames infection as epistemology, as a way of knowing. Infection is literally described as an opening through which foreign information enters. Whether the mechanism is molecular or not, the function of the infection is communicative, making it a fundamentally conceptual phenomenon. It is knowledge generation via contamination.
Let's move to our third point of contention, which is deeply rooted in philosophy, the role of eroticism and expenditure. My position is that the text materializes battalion excess entirely. Battalia's concept of the accursed share deals with energy or resources that cannot be used productively and must therefore be wastefully expended. The text takes this concept and just reduces it to gut-level processes.
And that reduction is unsettlingly effective.
Exactly. Organizational love is reduced to a gastrointestinal narrative. Desire is not psychoanalytic tension, it is fungal logic or metabolic grammar. Pornography is not sexual display but a metabolic transparency, the visibility of interiors. The entire economy is driven by excretion. Semantic semiotics appears as the return of fecal chemistry. Everything, even high philosophy and emotional connection, is reduced to biological consequence and metabolic waste. The materialist reading is, I think, absolute here.
I'm not convinced that the philosophical context is lost, only translated. The structure of Bataille's philosophy, expenditure without utility, is absolutely maintained. The expenditure is still excess, what the text calls the heteropoetic erotic sacrifice. Even when desire, himeros, is defined by enzymes and toxins, it is described as a labyrinthine semiotic architecture. The conceptual structure, a labyrinth, is still prioritized, even though biological components are what fill it. The debate remains philosophical. I mean, look at the text discussion of death. It states, necrophilia here is not erotic pathology, but the philosophical drive toward matter's irreversible decomposition. That means the driving intellectual force is the philosophical interest in what happens when meaning permanently collapses into inert matter. The biological description is serving the philosophical problem of total non-meaning.
But the mechanism of that irreversible decomposition is entirely physiological. The philosophical interest is only accessible through the physiological process.
Precisely. Which brings us to the epistemic status of the microbial. I would argue the microbial is utilized to describe an alien literacy, or what the text calls D-language, or a posthuman literacy defined fundamentally by illegibility. The mini-circle DNA, being illegible by design, refuses the narratability of the genome, serving as a philosophical critique of the illusion of coherence and completeness in our linguistic systems.
And I reject the notion that this is mere critique or a philosophical exercise in illegibility. The microbial is the literal author and the necessary structural component for meaning creation. Fungi and bacteria are declared the real authors of poetic configuration. The amoeba Belemutio mandrillaris, a creature known for causing fatal brain infections, is not an allegory.
That's a powerful distinction. But how do you integrate the text's own language then?
The text states, the amoeba's activity is a structural necessity. Its pathology is linguistic. Its necrosis is epistemological. Necrosis, the death of the host tissue, is not a regrettable accident. It is the necessary condition for knowledge. Host destruction represents the erasure of everything, a blank page for parasitic rewriting. This is not a metaphor for abstract illegibility. It's the structural mechanism by which meaning is generated, the biological necessity of host destruction, for parasitic rewriting to occur. The biological fact is the grammar.
But for that rewriting to be understood, even as illegible or alien, it still has to function within a semiotic context. The act of calling the amoeba's necroses epistemological is the very move that pulls the biological fact into the conceptual realm. It demonstrates the author's conscious decision to use biological processes as semantic tools. The microbial becomes the ultimate literary device.
And that is where we continue to diverge. To me, the text forces us to confront that the literary device is the only thing left, because the material reality has already subsumed the conceptual. Conclusion.
To summarize my position, the power of this source material lies in its radical, uncompromising commitment to metabolic materialism. It forces us to accept that thought is never truly immune. It is only ever incubating a new idea or a new pathology. This pathogenic biolinguistics provides a devastating new axiom. Semiotics is not an abstract system of signs. It is an excess right encoded entirely in metabolic chance. Biology is grammar.
I see why you emphasize that material subsumption, but my perspective remains that the text's greatest innovation is its construction of a xenopoetic language. By treating pathology as grammar and highly specialized biological facts as vocabulary, it successfully destabilizes classical linguistic boundaries and shatters the fantasy of linguistic homeostasis. The work is a form of mycotextual economy, where literature isn't a product, but a digestive, transformative process of biological and conceptual substrates. The reader is left to determine if the contamination is biological fact or a structural poetics designed to challenge our assumptions.
And perhaps the most unsettling realization that emerges from this complex layering of biological fact and linguistic speculation is that the posthuman condition is ultimately one of chronic infection and recursive complexity, regardless of the precise philosophical register we use to describe it.
Indeed, the parasite ensures that the system remains open, unstable, and perpetually generating new language from decay and irreversible decomposition. The instability is the structure itself.